Good morning, friends. How are you all this morning? I wasn't quite expecting that, but feeling good is just fine. This is an endlessly fascinating subject that we're going to talk about this morning, the relationship between the ego and the soul, the relationship between the individual and the whole, between our consciousness of separation and the potential to have the consciousness where we realize our unity with all that exists. It's a really fascinating subject. And in the Bible, this passage was a very interesting and very apt analogy for it, that God or Christ consciousness is the vine and we're the branches. And so we draw from that universal source, but drawing from that universal source is partly due to our desire to draw from it. It breaks down a little bit because we don't normally think of the branch of a vine, say a grapevine. We don't think of that branch as being conscious. But in fact, all life is conscious, and plants are much, much more conscious than what we normally give them credit for. So in this analogy, it's better to think of that branch as being conscious and able to draw more substance from the vine or draw less substance from the vine. And that analogy is a much truer one. Yoganandaji said something very interesting. He said that we all know that we're sustained by the sun. The sun's rays create the conditions for all life on earth. And that enormous globe of the sun and the energy that is being beamed out all of the time is what enables life to exist on earth. We don't realize how powerful these forces are. To think about it, the earth, the size of the earth, if you put it across the diameter of the sun, there are about 1 million Earths across the diameter of the sun. And so if we think of the sun roughly as the size of this room, there are 1 million little Earths across that. Now, I don't know, let's say it's 100 feet across. I don't know exactly what that size is, but the Earth is like the size of a period in a written word. And the sun yet is putting out so much energy that Earth, which is located like in Sacramento, so you've got a period in Sacramento, you've got the sun putting out all that energy, and that period is receiving it, and all life is possible because of that. But think of all the other, that's just such a tiny, tiny portion of the energy that sun is putting out that the earth receives. We think of it as our sun, but we receive just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what it's putting out. So this universal consciousness sustains everything in the whole universe. Master Paramhansa Yogananda said something very interesting. He said that because we are also sustained and energized by the sun, he said it's good to do some sunbathing each day. Probably you need to have the protection, I don't know. But at any rate, that we receive energy from that. But he said, if you do it consciously, as opposed to unconsciously, you can receive 100 times as much energy from the sun as you would otherwise, being unconscious. And so, coming back to that vine, if that vine is conscious and consciously drawing, it can receive 100 times as much of the nutrients as if it were just there being unconscious. So we're sustained by the energy of God. We don't normally cognize it, but we think because what we're really conscious of is our thoughts, our emotions, we think that that's who we are, but we aren't. You couldn't, for a second, even digest your food with your conscious mind. That power to digest, the power to move the nutrients around the cells, all of that is done by some universal force that has nothing to do with your conscious mind. So we're kept alive by this beautiful energy, the sustaining energy that is flowing to us through the vine. But we have a part in that too. We have to open ourselves ever more completely to that sustenance if we want to draw more. Yogananda ji said that there's a kind of a formula for advancement on the spiritual path. He said it's 25% our effort, 25% the effort of the Guru on our behalf, and 50% the grace of God. So we only do 25% of the work, but it has to be more in our consciousness. We can't say, oh, gee, I think I'll leave the 75% of the hard stuff to him and I'll do the easy stuff. No, it doesn't work that way. We have to feel like we're doing as much as we possibly can. But in fact, the Guru is working on our behalf. We're under the protection. We had a kind of an astrological, it's called a nadi reading, like a Bhrigu reading. And in that reading, it was a very interesting reading, but there was one part in it where he said, you, to Devi and me, you have given your life to the Guru. Understand that he is taking care of you minute by minute and second by second. And so if we give ourselves to God, then God takes care of us. Now, it may not always seem like he's taking care of us in the way that we want to, because, let's face it, we like the snack food. We don't like the good salads all the time. So if we're eating Twinkies and he says, no, you've got to eat your salad, maybe it doesn't seem like he's giving us the care we want, but even the difficult things that come to us come always, everything, absolutely everything that comes to us comes as a blessing and an act of love from the divine. But now coming back to our part. So sitting out in the sun, if we consciously draw those rays, we receive more, 100% more, 100 times more. If we do our part, then we open ourselves to that flow of grace. I was able, one of the great blessings in my life was that I was able to spend some time with the great, great woman saint, Ananda Ma. And when we visited, people from Ananda, knowing that I was visiting, Swamiji and a couple of other people from Ananda, they gave us a lot of malas and beads and holy objects and pictures that they wanted her to bless. And so when we came to her, we had this little mound of things and said, Ma, will you bless these? And she said, why do you ask this body to bless those? Don't you understand that God's blessings are always pouring down? Why ask this body to bless those? We said, well, we know, Ma, but will you bless them too? And she kind of laughed and of course blessed them. But it's very important that we understand God's blessings are flowing down. And Swami has used the image that it's like sunlight on a building. That sunlight doesn't discriminate whether the occupants of that building are nice people or not. That sunlight is just there. But if we open the shutters, then more sunlight comes in through the window of our receptivity into our life. If we close the shutters, then it's closed and less light comes in. So our part is to open ourselves, as we say in the purification ceremony. The Master says, open your heart to me. It's really our heart. The spiritual path isn't really tread with the mind. It's tread with the heart. Open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. The vine says to the branch, open yourself, draw from me, and I will enter, and I will sustain you. I will sustain your life, and you'll bear much beautiful fruit because of that. And so our part is to open ourselves. Ramakrishna, the great saint, used a very nice image. He said that God's grace is like the wind on the ocean, and we're sailors. And he said the first thing a sailor has to do is he has to untie his boat from the dock. Most of us don't do that. And then we wonder why we aren't making a whole lot of progress. Well, we have to untie our boat from the dock. But then a good sailor tries to trim his sails. Now, he doesn't produce the wind. He doesn't produce the currents. He doesn't produce the power that pushes that boat along. But the good sailor, our job is to trim our sails so that we align ourselves and catch as much of that grace as it's possible to catch. And when we do that, through meditation, through service, through leading a good life, when we align ourselves properly, then we're pushed along faster toward the goal. In this case, we're trying to sail across the ocean of delusion. And so we have a very, very definite part in this. And yet the Guru is also having a part in it. One of our members had a wonderful dream one time. He was, in the dream, he was walking along on the beach, and he had, one of those little plastic buckets and plastic shovels that kids have to put some sand in. But he saw this enormous mound of black, tarry, sticky stuff. And he knew it was his karma, and that he was supposed to get rid of that. And so he went up with this little toy shovel, and after a lot of work, he got just a little chunk of it off and put it in the bucket. And he's working away, and he's thinking, this is going to take me forever to get through this mound of black, tarry, sticky junk. And then he heard this big sound from behind. And he kind of got curious, and he walked around behind. And there was Master in a great big skip loader. And he was just digging into the mound from behind and taking enormous chunks out of it and getting rid of it. And so if we open ourselves to the Guru, open ourselves to God, God will help us. But because He's given us free will, if we say, in essence, I'm going to get rid of this stuff. It's my stuff. I don't need any help. I've got the tools. I've got the shovel. I'm going to do it. Then He says, fine. You go ahead. Go to work. Get on with it. And so most of us shut Him out, but we just have to draw Him in. And so that opening ourselves to Him is the biggest part of what we want to do. That's why in the reading it ended by saying that to the disciples especially, Master emphasized attunement. Attunement is just aligning our will, aligning our sails with the wind of grace that comes from the Guru. But I wanted to end, last night I had a very interesting dream because there's another level that's even deeper. So the 25% effort implies that we're still at the level of the ego, because If I have to make 25%, who's the I? In reality, the Guru and the grace of God, it's all one. So anyway, to bring you to the dream last night, it was a very interesting dream, one that I would call a semi-superconscious dream. Semi-superconscious because it had a deep spiritual teaching in it, and semi-superconscious because a true superconscious dream comes with great power and great clarity. And this had the spiritual teaching, but not that great power. Now, I won't go into the backstory. There is a backstory of why I had this dream, but it had to do with some dear friends of mine. And I got a letter yesterday, and it's a couple, and I grew up with them from 7th grade on, and we were best friends and roommates in college, and we've kept in touch. So a dear, dear friendship. So our souls are linked together by the magnetic threads of friendship and caring. At any rate, I got a letter from my friend yesterday saying that his wife is going to be spending some weeks in the ashram of Amachi in India, and he wanted to know if we knew of an ashram where he could be during some of that time. He was going to be traveling some and so on. So that's the kind of backstory. In the dream, we were asked, Devi and I were in the dream, we had been asked by Amachi to come and help there at the ashram. And not knowing what we were supposed to do exactly, just had to do with my friend, I knew that. At any rate, as dreams are in its own kind of distorted reality, we were there and we had this little tiny hut, not even a hut, just a cell that had 2 beds and a little place in the center for a fire because we had to cook our own food. And so we were given some rice and some lentils, and we were supposed to cook it. And I was out, and it was one of those dreams that had lots and lots of details in it. But I was out trying to gather fuel for the fire. And there were little kind of piles of like construction material that had been thrown out, so little pieces of wood and so on. And I was gathering up these pieces of wood and thinking in the dream, I wish I had a basket. This is not very efficient. I can't carry them. I wasn't exactly complaining. It was just, kind of, nothing was quite right in working out. And then all of a sudden, it struck me completely. You get these ideas intellectually, but you don't really have the realization of them. So all of a sudden, I started laughing and laughing with this enormous delight. And I was laughing and laughing so hard I almost fell over. And what had struck me was that it was all just dream stuff. I was dream stuff. The things that I was picking up was dream stuff. The whole scene was just dream scene. And for that instant, as in this chant, "From this dream, Lord, won't you wake, yet wake me." For that instant, I woke up in the dream. And I was laughing with delight and joy because of the realization that it was all just one thing, all made up of God's dream stuff, and it was all perfect. And someday, you and I are going to wake up from this dream, and we're going to laugh with delight, and we're going to think, oh, that was the most interesting, fun dream possible.
Okay, well, I'll just speak very briefly so the service won't go on too long. Master was asked, is this a new religion, what he brought to the West? And he said, no, it is not a new religion. It is a new dispensation, a new giving forth. And so when we think about the vine and the branches, this new giving forth of energy, and over the time we've been here in Palo Alto, we've done a number of satsangs, and it's been wonderful to share with you. But on Friday evening, we were talking about how Yogananda is a guide for our own inner power. And we quoted the phrase from the Bible, oft repeated in the festival, that Master often shared, "To as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God." And so we were talking the other night, what does it mean, the power to become the sons of God? And I'd like to touch on 3 aspects of it with you this morning. The first, we are given the power through the grace of God to deal with whatever tests come our way. There's nothing, no obstacle, no test, no trial, no suffering that comes in your life that you don't have the ability to deal with the grace of God. On our own, no. But with God's grace, yes. I remember some years ago, we were in a very, very demanding phase of our life. And we were just running nonstop. And I remember at a certain point, I just felt absolutely exhausted. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. And I went out on a little porch, balcony in the building we were living in, and I just sat there and I just wept. And I just said, Divine Mother, I don't have anything more to give. I'm depleted. And I was just weeping. And then it was the most remarkable experience. In an instant, I heard this voice that said, "Who do you think is doing all this?" That's all it said. Who do you think is doing all this? And in an instant, I couldn't find a tear. I couldn't find exhaustion. I got up. It was like, oh, okay. But it was like it was like a split second that happened. And so the power to be able to deal with whatever tests come your way. Remember when you feel like this is more than I know how to deal with. Call on God. Say, I can't do this, but you can do it. You can do it easily. And we saw so many times Swamiji. Once I remember we were in India. He was very ill, and he was scheduled to deliver a big lecture. A big hall had been rented in Gurgaon. And he said to us the night before, actually at breakfast, we were staying with him, he said, you know, I'm just not going to be able to give this talk. You will have to do it for me. And we said, whatever you want, Swamiji. And so he went into his room. We were scheduled to leave at noon. We got prepared to go. We were just passing his doorway on the way out of the building. Then his door opened, and there was Swamiji in his orange robes, looking as bright as a penny, just so sweet, filled with light. And he said, okay, let's go. And then as soon as the talk was over, the energy was gone, and he was just in his bed. But the ability to call on that power in our tests and in our trials, that is one of the greatest gifts of tuning in as a branch of the vine. Another aspect of awakening this power within us, the divine power, is being able to accomplish what we set our minds to do. And again, I remember, for those of you who follow our blog, we have a blog called The Touch of Light, and it's fun. It comes out every week. You can find it on jyotishanddevi.org. But we told a story that recently that when Swami was painting he was moving into his dome at Crystal Hermitage, and it needed to be painted. And he invited some of us to come over and paint with him. And I was part of the group that went over. And we started painting in the morning, and we painted till about lunchtime. He said, okay, let's take a break, meditate, have lunch, and come back about 2. So we did. We came back at 2, and I was assigned to paint the struts around the big hexagonal picture windows, sort of like these beams. And so we started about 2 o'clock, and I was up on a stepladder, and Swami was painting along with us. This was early 1970s, and I just was so concentrated on this, And we just kept going and going and going. And finally, we'd finished it. And Swami said, oh, thanks, everyone. Why don't you, time to go home, call it a day. And we looked at our watches, and it was literally 3 o'clock in the morning. And we had painted all afternoon. We hadn't stopped for dinner, kept painting and painting. And that was the most magnificent gift Swami gave us, because he showed us it's not your power that does anything. We would have been tired, but he just said, be in tune with that flow of joy, and you can accomplish whatever you want. That power will flow to you. And a few years ago, this very fine Swami from India, from Rishikesh, Swami Shankar Ananda, some of you may have visited him. He has a Kriya Yoga ashram there. He came and we were showing him around Ananda village. And he said, I don't understand how Swami Kriyananda was able to do all this. And then he said, oh, now I understand. He didn't do it. God did it. And that's what Swami always said. And Master said, to our own, but God-given power. And so to be able to accomplish more than you ever thought you could, tune into the source. Don't just think, oh, I've got to have the right diet and chia seeds. I just read about those. I mean, it's not going to make a difference, really. It may help on a superficial level, but that real power, that real sustenance comes from tapping into the taproot of God's strength. And then finally, the power to become the sons of God. What do you think even gives you the ability to think of God? It's not our own ego that thinks of God. Try to be cognitive of the fact that every inspiring thought you have, every devotional thought you have, every aspiration for freedom comes from God. It isn't yours. You didn't create it. How could we, children of this world, learn to love by our own powers? Says one of Swami's songs. And remember when when Swamiji first came to Master, and he was so on fire to find God, and he was meditating, and he was just doing everything he could, chanting and serving and just giving his life to God. And one day, Master commented to some of the other disciples who reported it to Swami. Master said, look how I've changed Walter. And Swami at first was surprised because he thought, Walter is what Master called him. He thought he was doing it all. Look how I've changed Walter. Remember that when you sit to meditate, when you're struggling to keep your thoughts focused, when you're struggling against the discouragement or emptiness or any of the downward pulling energies of this world, it's God that's calling us to Him. It's His power that enables us to keep walking the spiritual path. And without that, we would be blown away like leaves in the wind. And so, remember as Rajasi said, Master said, don't forget where your power comes from, Rajasi, his most advanced disciple. He said, I won't, Master, it comes from you. And speaking of Rajasi, if you recall, Master had said to Swamiji, you have a great work to do. He didn't say what it was, but we can see a glimmer, even now, of what that worldwide force for upliftment of humanity was. But then later, when after Master had passed, and Master's mantle had passed to Rajasi, Rajasi said to Swami, echoing Master's words, although he had never been there when Master said that, Rajasi said to Swamiji, God has a great work to do through you, and He will give you the power to do it. And that is the story of Ananda. But it's also all of our story, because God will give us, if we open our hearts He will give us the strength and the discrimination to find Him, not by our own, but by God-given power. So rejoice. Whenever you feel the desire to pick up the autobiography, to pick up an inspiring book, who's prompting that? Try to realize God is calling me and I will come. And if we do that, then the day comes where there's no more any distance to be crossed. When we hear that call, we say, Lord, let us go together into that light.